Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our latest productivity talk, organized by the Asian Productivity Organization, where we feature guests who do interesting work at the nexus of policy, production, and technology in Asia and beyond. This is Polchait Kraparyun, and I'm with the Digital Programs and Information Unit, as well as the Public Sector Unit of the APO. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a remarkable story of innovation play out worldwide. In the face of a global pandemic, governments, private sector companies, and researchers around the world worked together to produce a range of innovations in rapid succession. The creation and rollout of rapid diagnostics, therapeutics, and even novel vaccines using mRNA technology. While the pandemic continues, there's no doubt that its harms have been lessened because of these innovations. However, the question arises, could we see a similar response to the climate crisis and other sustainability issues? Are our innovation systems structured correctly to address these pressing challenges? To talk about this and more, today we have Dr. Kira Matus, Associate Head of the Division of Public Policy from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She has a deep expertise in the areas of innovation for sustainable development and regulation, particularly regarding standards and certifications, along with many other aspects of sustainability science and policy. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Matus.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about your background. So how did you come to work on innovation and sustainability issues? Where did the interest originally stem from?
No one ever asked me that. It's actually a very good question. So I've always been multiple interested kind of person. I'm like your traditional American liberal arts student. And so I was especially interested in science and also politics and policy. And undergrad, I actually studied chemistry, but I did that at Brown, where you have this very open curriculum. And so I was also involved with a lot of local politics. And, I was always thinking, I talked a lot about climate change and so on. And one day I was helping run a political campaign right before my senior year. And I'm in some debate, and the candidate, someone who I respect a lot, said something like, as we can see from the warm weather today in this venue, global warming is a real problem. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, is this what the discourse is? And that's the point where I kind of switched from going to do a PhD in chemistry to going into public policy, because I said we need more people who understand science and technology in public policy. And so it was in graduate school. I went to the technology and policy program at MIT that I first really started being exposed to people who are working on this intersection of innovation, technologies, green tech, climate change, and I was hooked. And so I had this very kind of tech-heavy, innovation-heavy master's degree, and then I went down the river to Harvard, where they're very good at the policy part, and became much more conversant in kind of the policy governance side, but working once again with people and on areas like green chemistry, sustainability in the chemical industry, and chemical production, where there is these growing awareness of the importance of innovations that support sustainable development and a lot of practice developing. And so that was really, I think, when I finally found the spot where I could take the policy, the chemistry, the sustainability, and the innovation and put that together kind of during my dissertation, that's when things really got chugging. So I kind of knew I was interested in this area, but I wasn't sure what you did with it until that point. And after that, it's just it's become more and more important. The conversations have become much more nuanced, and what's actually happening in the world is so much more exciting than I could have even imagined maybe 10 or so years ago. You probably would have laughed at us if we talked about the actual trajectory of things like solar and wind. Like if we'd used those as our scenarios in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, you wouldn't have gotten published in a paper because it would have been like, that's not a realistic scenario. And yet here we are. So why? How? What happened that allowed for these massive changes in scale? And why aren't we seeing them other places? Became a really important kind of thing. So it's the culmination of a lot of long-standing interests that for a long time didn't kind of talk to each other. And then they came together. It was very exciting. So.
Right. So do you think it was totally fortuitous, or did you think you saw something kind of in terms of the trend?
Well, I think the conversations were there, right? I think the conversations were there and I was looking for it, but there was a few steps along the way are always fortuitous. So I just happened to be showing up for my PhD at the same time that Paul Anastas, who's kind of the father of green chemistry, now at Yale, but then a DC-based non-lab scientist, was in residence with my advisor. right? That wasn't planned by anyone. And they're like, oh, we have a chemist and we have another chemist who wants to do green tech. Like, this is perfect. And that was not my plan. I was going to do more urban sustainability, which I do now a bit still. But I was going to do much more like urban water systems. And yet I turned on a dime because I'm like, oh, this is what I really want to do. So yeah, it was a bit fortuitous, at least that beginning part.
Right.
But it was there. I mean, I was looking for it.
And it sounds like it was a transition that kind of took a few years to kind of turn you from kind of chemist to public policy scholar. Did you find it a difficult transition? Like how different is the sort of thinking, the kind of frameworks, the sorts of people involved in either field?
I think, I mean, for one thing, I wasn't deep enough. I wasn't, I didn't already do a PhD in chemistry. So it wasn't necessarily that hard. As I said, I have a very liberal arts background. So the whole time I was studying science, I was also reading history and political science and so on. So in that sense, it wasn't that challenging. I think if you are interdisciplinary, if you're inclined that way, you become very adept at picking up other disciplines' conversations, right? So having that educational experience where I'd be like, oh, we're going to take an upper level history course today. I've got to figure out how the history folks write a paper. Like that became very useful later on. But there is a difference. And when I speak to different audiences, I speak very differently. The talks I write, the book I just did a book chapter for a green chemistry compilation on how to commercialize green tech, and I'm the policy chapter. And the way I wrote that policy chapter was actually very hard, right? Because it's very different than when I usually write about regulation and policy in this space for a very academic audience, right? Which is kind of more fun, but you had to really think about what is it, how do you express this in ways that people who are mostly concerned with bench tech or marketing can understand. So it does take a little bit of ability to kind of understand the audiences and adjust yourself.
And yeah, I think that touches on something that I think we'd like to talk about today, which is kind of the relationship between the scientific community and public policy. But maybe we'll get into that later. So how about first we give people a kind of overview of innovation and innovation systems, since that's kind of the main topic of today's talk. So maybe before we get into kind of specific issues, you could give us maybe a framework or an easy way to understand innovation.
Yeah, so innovation and innovation systems. So I think if you go back and do a little bit of a historical sweep of academic studying innovation, right? So there's people who are out there designing new technologies and they kind of know how it works in the sense of their own perspective. And since the 50s, even a little bit before that, maybe the 30s, economists especially were very interested in innovation as this kind of residual almost. That's actually what the Nobel Prize went for, saying, there's this thing that happens with technology upgrading that impacts productivity, right? So like we look at wage like labor and capital, and there's something else going on there, and they call that something else innovation. And that was kind of the starting point of a lot of modern innovation studies. But it was very much like, we have scientists and engineers over here, and they do some basic research, and then they maybe move it to the applied research, and then they pitch it over the fence to commercialization. It's a very linear process with not so many actors. Like you have some companies, you got some nerds, scientists, university types, and that's kind of how it happens, right? And then what you began to see is when you actually start to look, it's much more complex. And so innovation systems are the idea that what's really going on is networks of different actors in a kind of economic area, system, geography, technology area. So you may have universities, you may have small startups, you may have venture capitalists, you may have other sorts of investors, you have the government, supporting different parts like research or subsidies or something like that. And then of course you have users and customers of different types in different places. And it can grow from there. And so this was really something that picked up steam when people started to ask questions about the Asian tigers, especially. So people were starting to talk about this for Japan, Thailand, right? How is it that places like Singapore, Taiwan, Japan were catching up, right, with kind of Western Europe and North America? And the answer was starting to look at how government, industry, academia, kind of the markets all work together in different ways and how they interacted. And so it was a much less linear process. So we come to it from that perspective that it's not necessarily just as simple as someone invents something, like learns something in a lab, invents a product, and then commercializes it. That there's a lot of other steps and policies and kind of market aspects that go in there. And so one of the things that has come up, of course, is that was a lot of that understanding just comes from kind of what I call normal tech, right? Industrialization, develop of like microchips, and computing was a big area of study for this. Automotive production, right? Kind of big old industries to start, and then moving into high tech. But the thing that is missing, or was missing for a long time, was the sustainability aspect, which we can get into. So a lot of what I've done is try to understand what happens when you add this sustainability twist to innovation systems, and perhaps we can delve into that in a little more detail. But the idea of innovation systems is trying to understand who has leverage, right? Whose decisions, whose investments, whose actions or lack thereof influence whether a technology becomes something successful and widely used that has economic and social benefit.
Right. And so you mentioned a couple different sort of actors here, players, the government, private firms, researchers. You also mentioned kind of some of the background conditions, like the regulatory environment, maybe the financing.
Trade law.
Yeah. Yes, right. So I wonder, is it possible, or is it misleading to give people like an idealized or like archetypal innovation system, and to explain like what the role the players that are in the system typically play? Like,
I think it's hard to say typically, right? Because once again, one of the things that makes it interesting is the degree to which it's hard to give an archetypal on this, and the comparative work has been very rich about looking at different ways different actors get involved, right? So traditionally, though, academics tend to be more on the knowledge development and kind of early phase side, and then the question is like, if we look at biotech, right? How do we spin from university research to kind of small startup, and then when does big pharma and bigger biotech come buy them out, and then how does that then work with, say, government regulators to get something on the shelves for a drug? So you can think that the government's doing a lot of regulation, but they're also doing a lot of investing along the way in different parts of this. And then you have firms that typically show up, generally speaking, lately more downstream. If you go back 40 years or more, you have a lot of the stuff actually came from firms that invested much more upstream, like your Xeroxes, your DuPonts, your Bell Labs. But we seem to be seeing a lot more of that happening in publicly supported spaces, even if it's small startups, but still with a lot of kind of government startup money. And so you see a lot of the kind of risk, early phase risk, actually being taken on in the public sector, and later phase risk perhaps more by industry. So that's one thing you can kind of think about. But it gets more complicated when you have to kind of start looking at particular technologies, right? Because IT and ICT looks very, very different in terms of who does what and how much role, say, industry and startup capital and venture capital play versus, say, chemicals or agriculture, right? Where agriculture tends to be a lot of public sector and a couple of really big ag giants. So it is very dependent on sector as to what different actors do and how they play.
Well, that's quite interesting, because that kind of runs against maybe the impression I had, which was that we're seeing maybe less, and maybe this is a different angle on it, but we're seeing less kind of funding or resourcing given to like basic research, and there's been a big shift in terms of like, let's say, R&D towards like private sector firms doing kind of more applied research that's maybe more applicable towards like that latter stage of innovation.
I think it depends a lot on the sector.
Right.
I think first of all, the only people who fund basic research are governments. Yeah. Right. So in that sense, yes. So it used to be that some of these big research intensive industries, I come from a chemicals background, so I know a lot about the chemicals industry. The big chemistry companies used to do a lot of basic research, and they do not really have that same scope. Same with, like, say, if you talk to people who are at Pfizer 40 years ago, you often hear a similar story, right? That they just don't do as much of the basic research. And in fact, often, like I see with green chemistry, actually these roundtables where a bunch of pharma companies together say, we all have the same kind of basic research need, and we pool together some money and we give an academic who bids for it, writes a proposal, $100,000, $500,000 to solve a reaction problem that we all have, because we just don't do that anymore, right? But we're happy to like pay a bit of money and put it in the public because we'll all benefit, and then it happens. So you see a bit more of like so that gets the public sector, and then the applied. And I think there is a movement in a lot of countries towards focusing a lot on applied and commercializable research funding. But what is applied and commercializable? Anyone who's written a research grant knows that there's a very fuzzy
Right.
space. What you claim on a research grant is going to be commercializable in 3 years, and companies do come in and match on things that maybe aren't as immediately obvious. So I think there's a lot of gray space in kind of what you think of how that happens. But nonetheless, I think that at least in some, maybe not all, but in some industries, more and more of that is happening, not in the usual suspects, as I said, like your big pharma companies, right? That they're picking up these spinouts that are surviving on combinations of grant money and maybe a little bit of small venture funding. So it's changing, I think, as well.
Right.
But it depends on the sector once again, right?
Um,
And also you do
yeah.
say ag, you see a lot of big ag funding public funding, university research, or you see independent international like ag institute kind of stuff. So it depends.
Okay, so a lot of it depends on the sector, and now we've kind of given people a little bit of information on kind of general innovation systems. Although, as you mentioned, a lot of it's very context specific. So maybe we can start providing some of that context. What makes innovation systems that are targeted towards sustainability or sustainability challenges different?
Okay, can I get my first slide?
Yes,
on
please.
From the okay. So this is my slide, and I apologize, I'm not a graphic designer. About innovation system failures. So if we look at what we do very well in terms of innovation, we're very good at making things for the people who are what I would like to call closer to the innovators, people who are socially, culturally very similar to people who have a lot to invest in innovation, in which case, basically like Apple is very good at producing products that are especially popular amongst, North Americans and Europeans with a bit of money. People who are what we call closer to us across various geographic, economic, and cultural dimensions, the few, the near, and the generally people with money to spend, or companies with money to spend. We are less good at innovating to meet the needs of people who are in the future, who don't exist yet, or who are further away from us or further away from the innovators in terms of economic status, cultural, and geographic need. Not that it doesn't happen, right? But it becomes more challenging. And the thing that we're very thinking about now, what are the technologies we'll need in a generation for people who may not be wealthy, culturally similar, et cetera, right? And that's the sustainable development point, right? If sustainable development is about inter as well as intra-generational equity, then thinking about investing now in technologies that will be needed 10, 20 years down the road, that's really hard because the incentives aren't there, because there are neither political nor economic pulls to that red space, right? Those people aren't around to vote with their wallets, and they're not around to vote with their, actually vote, so to speak, right? So they're an invisible constituency. And so that becomes much more of a challenge in terms of what incentives are out there. Okay, so that's what we think about as the underlying innovation system failure when we think about technologies that you need to support a sustainability transition, which is a generational project, not a 3-year or a quarterly project, right? So we have a mismatch. Okay, so do you want me to go into my particular innovation system framework then?
Sure, yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
So this is a model we call a THAMIS. And this is something that colleagues and I in the Harvard Sustainability Science program built over the course of about 4 or 5 years of research. And we were really interested in thinking about complex innovation systems from the perspective of sustainable development. And we wanted to understand both why it's challenging, but also to look at some successful examples, because they are out there, and to see if there are ways to do some systematic comparative learning. So we had a couple of important starting points for what we want to do and how we approach it, because there's a lot of innovation systems frameworks out there. There's a lot of excellent literature. We have the TIPS project, we have the mission-driven innovation folks, people like Frank Keels who have been doing multi-level perspective. Like there's some very well recognized, very useful, very insightful innovation frameworks, but no one that specifically has sustainable development as their underlying goal of what it is that we're looking to do, right? What it is these technologies need to support. And so while we actually think that what we did is largely applicable, it was inductively, we took data and we took the literature, and we said, this is how we want to conceptualize what is happening. And we wanted to catch 2 or 3 things we felt were largely missing from the discussion when we started. One is about access. So with sustainable development, you don't just want to build a nice market of people who pay. We want to meet a need, right? A lot of these technologies are out there to meet a very particular sustainability goal, sustainability need. Like you need particular health products, or you need agricultural technologies that allow you to more use less water, or less potentially problematic fertilizers, or approaches to, all kinds of different challenges, like water systems, health products that are appropriate under different conditions. So we said we want to study innovations that specifically support key sustainable development goals. So that itself is an unusual starting point. The other thing we said is we want to understand access. So we don't want to just understand that these technologies occur somewhere, but that they're getting to people who need them, right? Ideally, that like red dot I showed in the last slide, but even just getting to people who may be in kind of further away, or people who don't have necessarily the same kind of market power because of issues around poverty and inequality, economic inequality, right? But still have need. And then how do we support these, right? How do we support a system that doesn't just give access to a few, but that gives access to the whole space of need? And the final thing is that we took from this the perspective not so much of what we want to know as academics, but what practitioners we found were constantly asking. Governments, firms, aid organizations, international organizations, which is, what do we need to do? Where can we best invest our resources? And resources may be money, but they may be other things, and we'll get to that, right? Where are we maybe too many of us all piling in and being redundant? And where are there problems that aren't getting picked up? And so we had a very practitioner approach. Okay, so that's the background to what I've been trying to do now for a long time. And a lot of us came from a kind of a systems dynamics perspective, which informed how we think about this. And what we thought about, we played around a lot, was that it's kind of a classic stock and flow problem, and that we transform. So if you look at these white boxes here, if you start from the left, it's linear because we have to somehow move you through it, but it doesn't have to be linear. But we start with knowledge, right? That's the basic research, the understanding of the world. And we know that the definition of invention is applying knowledge to solve a problem. Okay, but we can come up with an invention, but we actually have to then take an invention and turn it into a technology that will actually work, right? We can make lots of them and we can get them out there. And that's what we call feasible technology stock, right? Which are things that are at the point of being potentially reproducible, kind of commercializable, et cetera. Not just an interesting idea on a patent or a prototype in my lab, but something I can actually, invest in and see come through. And then we do a few of those, and we maybe have a few, right? We've done a little bit, we have a little experience, and that's technologies in limited production and use. And then as they scale up, they become very widespread, very common, very well understood, very widely adapted and used. And then sometimes at various points along the line, things become obsolete, right? We retire them, we say they don't work, or they're no longer, fit for purpose, or something better comes along and they get kind of thrown in the dustbin. Sometimes they get actually picked up again later. But so we said, okay, then if we look at kind of what's the process that you go all the way from knowledge to something that is being widely used. And we use these names for stages. And these stages, which are the colored boxes, are very common. Like we pulled on the way that these are commonly talked about in the literature. So we talk about invention, then selection. And you can think about selection as like, when you go pitch to a venture capitalist and they have a bunch of people coming in front of them and say, oh, we want that one, right? That's not the only way that happens, but that's this process of picking from some ideas and prototypes and things that are out there and saying, what are we going to invest in? And then we have initial adoption, because some technologies, depending on if they're like social technologies or business technologies, right, can just kind of be picked up, or even a lot of software. Some things actually need to be produced, right? So if you have to actually go and build a bunch of factories to produce your electric vehicles, you actually have this production stage where you have to figure out how to go from a few prototypes to mass production. And then that gets widespread use. But all along the way, these technologies get adapted, right? We know that by the time anything arrives on our desks or in our homes or in our workplaces, they have been tweaked and adapted and updated and changed in a variety of different ways. So that's the adaptation box across the top, which is very important, especially if we think about moving technologies to different places, different user groups, right? Even if it works really well with one, often you have to change things around, even if it's just to make, an electrical appliance work on a different voltage system, right? These things all require some amount of adaptation. And so we built this framework because that allowed us to then understand how different technologies move or get stuck, where they get stuck, why they get stuck, what are effective ways to get them unstuck, right? And then that tells us where we need resources and what kinds of resources, who has those resources, right? So that was the process of this framework, which is honestly a bit complex, but it is a complex innovation system framework. So there's kind of no way around that.
Right, thank you. And I guess when you were talking originally about innovation system failures, specifically for sustainable development, I think you were kind of talking about the idea of that there's this sort of collective action problem or a kind of coordination failure that happens when you're addressing these kind of systemic challenges that are occurring at kind of long time scales. So I'm wondering, is that pointing to an increased role for government and public agencies in this space compared to maybe in your normal kind of market-oriented innovation system?
I think that's the argument that a lot of people are making, right? That if you're talking about who takes on risk on 10, 20, 30-year scales, that is in many cases considered to be the role of the public sector, or at least partially the role of the public sector, right? So and they traditionally have done this. I mean, at the end of the day, investments in your knowledge sector, in your universities, et cetera, right? Those are long-term investments. You get a little bit now, but you get the real benefits, a generation down the road sometimes. And you don't know. We don't know when we invest in some big basic research project if it's going to be helpful tomorrow. Sometimes it's helpful in 60 years, right? And we do it. So it's kind of a continuation of this idea that there's this kind of positive externality, as the economists would say. And in that case, that's a very good argument for having the public sector involved and more involved, right? Because normal markets, the way we structure most capitalist markets, aren't interested in something that has a 10-year payoff or a very small payoff in direct dollars, right? But who pays the cost of rising sea level and rising healthcare costs because of air pollution and things like that? The public purse does, right? So the social benefits may have very real economic impacts for governments, right? So then it becomes somewhat to their benefit, economically, socially, normatively, to be investing in these. They're not the only ones, though. Philanthropies can do it. Foundations, are very big, but there is a big argument that these are technologies that are meant to address social problems, and if they're meant to address social problems, then some sort of social investment or public investment would then be appropriate, more so even than other areas.
And you mentioned investment. Kind of the example you used was the idea of basic research, and I think that's an example that's probably familiar to a lot of people. But are there kind of other ways that governments can really push forward sustainable development? Are we looking at something like a DARPA model, or I think?
Well, so the U.S. did this, in 2008 as part of its stimulus was ARPA-E, which was doing this for energy, right? And was there were a few that bombed, and there were some that were hugely successful, including Tesla, by the way. Took a huge amount of ARPA-E, and they paid it back very quickly. But that was one model, right? And that's one model that's being discussed as well, again, in the EU, that one way to do this is to have a really big top-down, we want to do this, and this, and we're going to put big money into potentially big impact projects. This is kind of the mission innovation discussion that we see that says, big areas in health and, electric systems like battery systems and other sorts of clean tech are areas that we're really going to decide to go in heavy from the government side to support in various different ways.
Right. And so investment, moving money around, and kind of setting like broad or like grand challenges or big missions. That seems to be one way. And what about, I know, for example, the Bank of England and the UK government in general were quite early on. This isn't sustainable tech related necessarily, but they were quite early on in terms of creating a regulatory environment for fintech related innovation. Also, I think they're doing a bit on autonomous and connected vehicles. So is that an alternative model, or kind of focusing on
One
regulatory
or the
and
other. Yeah, I
versus
mean,
money?
so this is so you mean like focusing on one thing or another thing?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's one approach. I think, I've done a lot of study actually of smaller OECD countries. So, people talk a lot about what Germany does, and the US and China and the UK. And I was actually very interested with some colleagues about what some of the smaller countries do, because they don't necessarily have a huge amount of money. They have money, but they don't have, China, US level money to throw at these technologies. And yet they're often leaders in both innovation and sustainability. So they seem to be doing something well. So we're kind of interested, what do they do? And you do see them picking up key sectors that they think have both social but also potentially economic benefit. So Ireland, which has a very well developed biotech and pharma sector, has really pushed a lot into that. And it's money, but it's also, they've made their tax situation for pharma companies such that it's very appealing to put an R&D facility there. And then they have a well-educated base of researchers coming out of the Irish university system, right? So they're doing a very good job developing people who can take up those roles. And so it becomes a very promising place to do this work. So there's both direct money, but also different sorts of policies and regulations that support it, right? That make the entire kind of thing very appealing. And so we see different countries have different approaches to this, focusing on technology areas where they're quite advanced, but they also have a social benefit. And then some of them are very explicit in saying, this is good for us because it's going to develop things we need and that will help us solve our own problems. But there's also a big economic dividend, and other people are going to want this stuff too, right? So everyone goes to the Dutch for water control.
Right.
And they're very good at it. And they've invested in it over the years, right? Both in terms of their own infrastructure, but in having this engineering and tech development constantly kind of emerging.
Yeah. And how does a country, how does it work at the national level? Because obviously you have all these different countries, maybe they're looking for kind of different niches, or they're looking at the kind of big players and they're saying, oh, there's a lot of investment in this area versus that area. How exactly do they discover the niche? Does it seem to be a process of trial and error, or are there a lot of failures that aren't talked about?
That's a good, I actually don't have a great answer to that question. Because partially, I want to thank COVID for this. I can't go into the field and ask them. No, it's really tricky, right? Because to get to that, then you need to kind of start. You have to do a lot of talking to people and find out the history of it. And it's not always clear if you look at the programs what the drivers were. Mm-hmm. But I would hazard to say that sometimes, I mean, if you have strong industries in these spaces, they're obviously going to be very supportive of things that support their industry. So there's always a bit of a positive cycle there, right? And a bit of pressure to support them. So I think there's some of that. But also, I mean, you do see sustainability strategies that say, here are a bunch of SDGs that are important to us because we have commitments, right? You see, we have a climate commitment. We have CO2 reduction commitments. How are we going to get there in ways that are beneficial? Oh, look, here are some areas, right? So and there is some copycatting, and I think there are some failures. I think there are things that don't take off, certainly. But they're sometimes hard to find, right? One of the things we've noticed is that you can find a lot about what the programs are. It's very hard to get an evaluation of what actually came out, right? So I think that's one space which we don't know as well, which is we know a lot about kind of what the inputs are. We're not so good about understanding how successful was it, what came out of it. Like that is not necessarily there yet.
Right, because presumably there's a little bit of political theater, or at least a political.
Well, there's political theater. There's also a lag time. Right? What is the scale we're talking about? If we're talking about scale of 3 years, maybe, but it might be that something that looks kind of 5 years on is very important in 10. And that's another thing we saw is technologies that, for reasons that are not about failure at the technology development side, potentially still have challenges until other things fall into place. So, you mentioned kind of fintech. So changes, and I know you're interested in kind of, green investing and things. Like if you change all of a sudden the availability of finance, like access to bond markets for some of these technologies, well, that's potentially a big game changer, but it's going to take us some time to find out for which things and which things not. But there may very well be technologies that kind of languished for a while because the funding mechanisms weren't there. It wasn't about whether they're good technologies. It was about could you pay to get them going? And will these bond mechanisms or other kinds of sustainable investing mechanisms or green VCs be able to get them over the hump? And it may be that for some tech, that's true, right? So is the period in which they languish, is that really a failure on the part of the government? Or is that more because you have to get all these different pieces and you can't always control them all?
Right. Yeah. And it's, as you kind of pointed out, there's so many actors interacting in this space. And you just mentioned sustainable investing, which is one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So there's been a very noticeable uptick in activity and investment in this kind of sustainability space, ESG space. There are tons of funds, VCs, accelerators that are explicitly targeting either sustainable tech or sustainable and socially impactful businesses. So what's your assessment on whether or not is this a meaningful trend that will drive a lot of change in terms of meeting our sustainability challenges, or is it kind of less important relative to you're saying the kind of mission-oriented public investment side?
I think it's important. I think you need a variety of things, right? So I think the biggest mistake is thinking that there's only one way to do this, because while mission may work for some areas, it's not going to work for everything, and we can't cover all the missions, right? That way, there's too many needs, so you need a lot of different ways for things to get picked up. The worry from the beginning with you said the word ESG, and I think people in the space immediately go, uh-oh. Because there's always, but that's because we know there's always some amount of greenwashing. And what we're not, it's nice that everyone puts LED light bulbs in their office spaces, but that's not the level of change that we need. That's just the very, very tiniest tip, the very tiniest top of a massive iceberg, right? And so if ESG, if it becomes more of a kind of greenwashing, not very meaningful, layering some sustainability aspect on tech, but still favoring things with high payoffs right now. It'll be good for those. We need those things, but it won't necessarily meet the down the road more long-term needs. So I think it's going to depend a lot on the rules and how those are structured and how good the data is. You can put together fabulous trading markets and have carbon prices go to zero. We know this, right? It's very challenging to get systems off the ground in meaningful ways. When they do, for particular areas, they can be very useful. But sustainability is such a huge space, right? You're trying to optimize so many different things that I think we need a combination of these things. And I think that these technologies are just starting to develop and we're just starting to understand them. And they're tricky, right? So I know we have a lot of work at UST and my colleagues in other places thinking about, green finance. What is the role of green finance? How is this going to work? What is it going to work for? Where might there be big gaps and blind spots? But we're early days, I think, for a lot of it still. But it's a nice, I find this to be an excellent trend, at least personally, because I think that the more we can take what we know about investing in new technologies and getting startups going and apply that to areas where we usually didn't do it, I do think that's beneficial. I do think for social impact, it's great to start to have social impact businesses have access to more resources. So, that we're starting to recognize the value here, I think is very important. But the devil will be in the details, as always. But
yeah,
I think there'll still be blind spots, right? That just won't get picked up by that.
I guess I wonder if there's going to be a kind of learning process, because presumably, let's say these VCs are coming from a background of they're used to investing in tech, kind of traditional tech or old tech, or they're used to investing in kind of just traditional profit-oriented businesses. There might be cultural differences, differences in underlying tech. Yeah,
VCs are not known for the diversity of the people they invest in.
Yes,
they don't invest in women. They don't invest in people of color. They invest in very particular people with very particular markers. And part of sustainability is breaking that, right? That idea that, that if you want to think about it from an economic perspective, right, you need to have more people have more access. So that's going to be a challenge, right? And we have also seen that some of these mechanisms around trying to finance tech, like a lot of the Red Plus and attempts from European countries to finance, various carbon reduction technologies or approaches in developing countries were very, very challenging. Verification was challenging. Implementation was challenging. Moving money around was challenging, right? So we already know that this isn't easy in implementation, at least if you want to do it well, right? So I do think there's going to be, but you can also start to say, if this starts to become a thing, hopefully what you'll also see emerging are new generations of VCs coming from different places and different backgrounds, getting perhaps funding from different, maybe from some of the same sources that traditional VCs do, but also maybe, foundations and other people who can have a bit of a hand in saying, if we're going to have sustainability venture capital, we need to look at this and have a kind of different culture around who is doing the investing, who's doing the decision making, where we're putting the money. I don't think it's insurmountable, but there's a bit of a culture clash between. I've been very, very gently dipped my toe into the kind of, being on the startup side of the kind of old tech or normal high tech world. And it's a really different world than the sustainability world. It does some things very well, but it does them a very particular way.
Right. And maybe this is a good segue to talk about, I think in a previous conversation, we talked about the sexiness factor when it comes to innovation. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So one of the things we found is that, there's certain things become trendy. I mean, for one thing, we see a lot about disruption in tech in general. And in fact, I've in some ways for sustainability, we need massive disruption. But at the same time, like disruption for the sake of disruption is not necessarily useful. And in the same way, like technologies become very popular, become very sexy. Like right now, everyone's talking about geoengineering. I mean, they have for a while, but right, like this seems to have a lot of play in the last 12 months compared to say the last 5 years. And everyone kind of piles into it and everyone's talking about it. And then they ignore things that are maybe less trendy, less interesting. With sustainability, often there might be really good technological solutions out there. They might not be as bright and shiny. Maybe it's a social solution. Maybe it's using something really like clean cook stove technology. There's a lot out there. A lot of it's really just about combining the right elements to understand what will be accepted in any kind of cultural context, right? It's not the work that needs to be done is not fancy inventing. It's as I said, like this hard work of adaptation. And it's often much more, we might say, like mundane. I mean, there's some really interesting household level water filters that are ceramic, right? Ceramic water filtration is not new by any means, right? But what's new is where you're using it, the system you're using to kind of produce it locally and get it to people, et cetera, and so on. So once again, like we tend to want things that are newer and shiny, and we sometimes ignore things that are in our toolkit that we may have developed in place A or for need A that could be useful in place B or for need B, because they aren't high tech enough or networked enough or whatever it may be. And it depends, right? These cycles change. But one of the things we said is that one of the sets of technologies that often have the most trouble are things that are often very affordable, very well understood, but they're considered to be a little bit mundane. Like, isn't that kind of old fashioned? Well, does it matter if it solves the problem? Probably not, right? So new and shiny for the sake of new and shiny can be problematic, right? So we talked a little bit about blockchain, and I have some people I do some work with who do work on sustainability and value chains, and they're like, we have a new one of these every few years. There's some new, it was RFID a few years ago, like now it's blockchain. They're like, but the problem that's not the problem. The problem is getting and verifying the data to begin with, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Like blockchain has some advantages, but it doesn't solve the problem that we've been fighting against for ages, which is that in these value chains, it's very hard to get good data about the sustainability conditions of anything that's kind of coming in. And it can be, that just because it's in the blockchain doesn't mean it was right to begin with, right? And so they're like, yes, but we actually have a different problem that this isn't going to solve yet. So there's that element too, right? So things get sexy and they're like, oh, we could do this here, but that technology may not actually address the problem that the people in that space really have. And that kind of plays into like wanting to do things because they're the thing right now.
Mm. And is there a particular set of challenges that are kind of unique to what you're describing as kind of more mundane technologies? Is that one of the reasons, or is it just because it's honestly just because they're not as sexy?
I think sometimes it's really just because we're like, oh, really?
Right.
You want us to put a lot of money into like, and if you think about it, I mean, there's this kind of, even with governments or NGO, like nonprofit foundations, they have to justify what they do to their investors. Now their investors may be taxpayers, their investors may be donors of various sorts, right? But like if you're supposed to be the most cutting edge, blah, 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 and then you're doing this very kind of basic thing, is that going to be acceptable? I mean, and it's I think sometimes too, it's just that we get really excited by things and we're like, oh, what can we do with this? Like, I think it's a very natural impulse. And so, it doesn't seem as exciting sometimes, but we haven't delved into that into that hugely much. It was one of these really interesting observations. Like, oh yeah, like once you see it, you can't unsee it. But all the factors, I think it's probably largely like there's a psychological and kind of sociological aspects to why that may be. But once you see it, you'll see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can think of a specific kind of, you mentioned clean cook stoves. Has there been, because you're talking about the kind of difference between, with the famous framework, adoption, turning from kind of initial adoption to widespread adoption versus just kind of ramping up production. I'm wondering if you're looking at initial adoption and turning into widespread adoption, there's much more of a social element or a storytelling element involved. Can you think of a technology where it looked mundane, but then they managed to tell a story very successfully?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I know there's examples out there. I'm trying to think of a good one off the top of my head. We had one of the cases we had was Plumpy Nut. I don't know if you know about Plumpy Nut.
I don't.
Plumpy Nut's a food supplement.
Yeah.
Which was initially a kind of a household invention, by some I think it was some aid workers. I'd have to go look it up, and eventually it took off and became like the supplement in use for issues of kind of malnutrition and starvation, especially in children, by a variety of aid agencies. And I think, if I go back and think about it, like that's one where, it's really just a mix of like a couple of different peanut butter and other nut. Like there's nothing there that's like super duper fancy, right? But what was interesting is their ability to package it and get it out and convince people that this relatively basic supplement, right, could be really impactful and was worth it. It wasn't very expensive, right? But you've got to like produce it en masse and send it out there. On the flip side, one that didn't work for in Nigeria was attempts to really push cassava-based bread, because cassava agriculture is much more sustainable, right? And there was a lot of kind of this, especially in kind of lower income farming communities, and the government was like, we need to convince people to eat cassava based bread, and they just couldn't do it. And in that case, I think there was a big food is tricky, right? So there's a big kind of cultural aspect of people just not really liking cassava bread, not knowing how to make it very, maybe the issues with the bakeries and all kinds of stuff. And so in that case, it fell apart. Maybe less because it was mundane, but people assumed because it was relatively straightforward, it would be pretty easy. And then it wasn't, because they got it kind of wrong. They didn't do a great job with kind of the
food's really tricky because there was quite a lot of conversation, and I think there's probably still some attention to this, creating like insect protein or insect-based foods. But obviously there's like this big initial kind of like the discuss factor.
Well, and the alternative, the meat alternative discussion is a really interesting one, because I think, there's a lot of like, how do we do this? Where do we? I mean, and this is, the technology itself is not very mundane, right? But at the same time, what are you making? You're making protein supplement, right? So it's not, it is what it is. But thinking about who are the influencers, like I know in Hong Kong, there's been a lot of work to try to get very influential kind of foodie types, restaurants, chefs, people who have a lot of, and of course the social media people, to put these on their menus, highlight them, not totally replace, but start to kind of integrate these in. They've been doing a lot of work to recreate traditional Hong Kong dishes with meat alternatives in some like kind of high-end trendy places to demonstrate, but there's this balance, right? It's like, but we also don't want to lose our traditional cooking at the same time. Like we don't want to totally replace what we've been doing forever, but so but there's a lot of really interesting, I think food tech is an area where this is going to be really useful to understand how you think about what are some of the challenges to adoption. And this is where adaptation is a big deal, right? The ability to use those food products in a variety of different cuisines in ways that people find locally acceptable to their tastes and their, food is very tricky, right? People are very particular. So you can't just be like, oh, look, it's just like ground pork, and expect that that's just going to take off everywhere, right? People want something very particular from it in different places. So I think that's going to be one where thinking about this a little bit more thoroughly is going to be very important. Yeah, the insect thing is, but here, like in some places, the insect thing is not as big a taboo as others, right? I mean,
in a lot of it's no big deal, or it's just kind of quite regular. Well, you mentioned adaptation. That's one of the big topics I wanted to ask about, because obviously the APO represents 20 member countries. Some of them are a bit further away from the technology frontier. and therefore they're often kind of waiting for technologies to come in, or waiting to kind of adapt or localize technology. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of trying to understand the adaptation process, especially I would say in middle to lower income countries, because the idea was always that, you know, the high tech stuff happens over there and then we push it over there. And I don't think that's actually as accurate as we think it is. However, there is some amount, of course, of wanting to be able to pick and choose, if you can do so. So I think one of the things that we found is that, you know, countries that have been successful adapters, once again, like investing in human capital is usually a massive part of that. Right? You have to be able to have people on the ground who are able to identify and then implement and do that adaptation process, because it's very hard for someone from someplace else to figure it out on their own, right? So having partnerships and having the capacity and the desire to do that adaptation are important. And sometimes you end up with something, you know, kind of new and localized and quite interesting. So yeah, I think adaptation in certain contexts becomes one of the really important roles that governments can play, and other public actors too, right, to support the conditions that you need for that, and to think about, you know, also in innovation. Like innovation is actually very global. Like I often study it from a very national perspective because I'm a policy scholar, so I'm interested, but sometimes I take a technology-based approach, which is very interesting, because then you see where different governments do different things, right, and invest in different ways or get involved in different ways. So often, you know, encouraging international collaborations and exchanges, establishing networks like that can be very powerful, because then you get these kind of two ways. You get what we call communities of practice. You get two-way exchanges, and then you start to have increased adaptation capacity. One of my favorite examples, though, is actually geothermal energy in Mexico, because Mexico had a very strong kind of geology and oil experience. They had a very strong engineering capacity, and it's not just engineers, right? It's all the little businesses, the mechanics that service the rigs, and all these other sorts of supporting infrastructures, right, to enable it to have a very successful oil and gas industry. And they were able to actually use a lot of that to develop geothermal in like the 90s. There's some really interesting work on this, but that is an example of how, you know, kind of as you build up your capacity in one area, it's often very useful for adapting to another. So there's also a very interesting line of work about, you know, how you kind of develop across different areas and industries in order to kind of allow you to, I mean, they often talk about moving up the chain, right? But even just, you know, if you want to be in if you want sustainability area A, do you have something that you are already pretty good at in your country that's somewhat similar, where you have overlapping skills at various levels, right? Both at the kind of the high end, like engineering or science people, but also just the kind of people on the ground who run the factory or the, you know, fix the machinery or whatever it is, that are able to then get in there and make it work in your local context.
So yeah, that's a really interesting example, in the sense that I think one of the concerns with shifting to, let's say, like renewable, sustainable infrastructure technology is, you know, the transition costs in terms of like employment, or, you know, we talk about like miners or oil rig workers. So that's a really interesting example, because presumably if you can kind of just fork your way to another, like geothermal, those costs would be reduced.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not that there aren't, I mean, it's tricky, right? It's not there aren't necessarily retraining costs and that, but if you can, you know, it's like this, how can we think about what the resources are we have here? Are they miners, or are they people who are skilled in doing X, Y, and Z? Right? What are the things they actually do, and what is that potentially useful for in other areas? So I think that countries that do that well have an advantage in that sense.
Right. So we've talked a bit about innovation systems. I wanted to ask also about your other area of work, which is kind of regulation. So if one studies sustainability standards and certifications, as you've done, I think, with particularly in the chemical industry, so what lessons can we kind of draw from that about regulation in general?
So I think there's a few things. I think first is that we tend to try to be really clever, right? Okay, we'll have a certification or a voluntary system, and one of the things I hear over and over again, especially in the chemical industry, is just give me a rule, make it work apply to everyone so it's fair, and just leave it be for a while, and I will adapt. So like the first thing they pay attention to is if you tell me something is legal or not legal, most, if not everyone, I mean, there's always a few scofflaws, right? But like everyone's gonna be like, okay, that's the reality of the thing. We might not love it, but especially if it applies to everyone, then that's just life, and we're going to deal with it. So the first thing is that, yes, politically speaking, they may push back against a lot of companies and industries push back about regulation, but they like clarity and they like consistency. So yanking your feed-in tariffs around at the last minute all the time, the way the UK has been known to from time to time, is really hard. It makes it very hard for people to invest. People don't want to be in that space because they can't figure out what's going on. If you tell them there's going to be a 10-year ramp down, then they plan for it, right? If you don't, you're like, oh, we're not sure we're going to do this again next year. Everyone's like, I can't be in this space, right? Like financially, technically, whatever. So there's a certain value to certainty, and there's a certain value to having a floor. So I do a lot of work on certification, and certification works best at convincing people to move to a higher level. But the people who usually convince are ones who are usually pretty close already, right? People who are way down here are like, oh, look, there's this nice bar for certification up here. Let me invest hugely. No, it's like people who are here are already here who want to be certified. So you can kind of push that up over time, but you kind of have to put the floor down, right? You have to say, okay, this amount of pollution is unacceptable, and we're not going to let you do X, Y, or Z. Now, how can we incentivize people to do even better? Right. So you do this with like fuel economy standards, for example, right? We say, okay, you've got to at least hit this minimum bar. And then we can talk about how we subsidize and reward people who do more. So that's the first thing with certification. So certification is very good, but it works even better if you have some sort of baseline, right? Because otherwise someone's just going to decide not to do it, and they're going to trigger this, kind of system where you have kind of the brown people and the green people, and you're still having the whatever negative thing you don't want. The second thing is that, well, first of all, it's very hard to determine how much impact certification has when you study it. But one of the things we found is that it's actually very useful as an innovation tool in sustainability spaces, because what it does is it creates both a test bed for particular practices or approaches, and actually distributes that knowledge. So if you think about FSC or Rainforest Alliance, they have a whole system of education, outreach, advisors, even the certifiers themselves are going from place to place and kind of transferring lessons that are learned on all the different places they're active, right? They're adjusting these certifications for local conditions, right? So doing a lot of the adaptation work. And then as they expand, like we see in the green building sector, you eventually end up with an entire system of suppliers of green products, of architects and designers who know how to use them, contractors who know how to install them, and kind of government agencies who are used to seeing them, like building inspectors and so on. And all of a sudden you see green building getting put into, by governments in various places, into their actual building codes, which is a huge shift, because all of a sudden sustainability issues are next to fire safety and electrical standards, right? So certificate, like, it's not that 80% of the world's buildings all of a sudden became, LEED or other equivalent green certified. It's that all of a sudden what was expensive and largely impossible 20, 30 years ago because there weren't products or expertise to do it is now common enough that you can say, you know what, we can say all buildings need to meet this minimum standard, because certification kind of paved the way for that to happen. Not perfectly, not without, there's a lot of issues around certification. It also, the other thing is that the nice thing about regulation is that it hits everyone. Certification usually benefits people who are already doing pretty well, right? They're profitable or well-to-do or well-educated, connected to the system, able to implement these technologies, right? So certification is also one thing we've learned is they work best if you're trying to do one thing. If you want to improve environmental performance, or you want to have better labor and labor and wages, you try to do both, you kind of dilute them both, or you end up doing one well and one not so well. And I think that's important for other technologies as well. When you think about international certifications, like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to make sure everything is interoperable? If I'm thinking about I do some work on algorithms and IoT and such, like, are we worried about interoperability standards, or are we worried about the social impacts of algorithms? Those may need to be two separate discussions in order for either one to be effective. So that's another thing we've learned about regulation, right? Is that if you try to do too many things with one thing, it can get messy.
Well, I'm wondering, because that's quite a compelling case for the potential benefits of certification. But if someone were to tell me, oh, it's going to create a community of practice in the long term, and things are just going to emerge, and there's going to be all this kind of skill building, it sounds a bit like unlikely as a story. So I'm just wondering, when people are designing certifications, is that the case? Yeah.
That wasn't necessarily the point. It was more of so the point was to change behaviors, right? And to do it, if you look at, so certifications themselves get certified. I don't know if you know this, but there's an ISO certification for creating a new certification, and sustainability ones. And there's actually an organization called ICL, the ICL Alliance, that actually publishes best practices for sustainability certifications. And a lot of that has to do with governance, but also how you actually go through and do, set standards, who sets them, who's involved in the process, and then how do you certify and how do you make sure things are certified properly, and so on and so forth. That was explicitly meant to broaden the spectrum of who's involved, for sure. So some of this creating a community, and it was actually a bit of a political project in terms of bringing industry, government, producers, and some NGOs to the table and creating an excuse for a political alliance. That was explicit, I think, in the program. So some of that was in fact part of the point. The education and the adaptation and the circulation of technologies was also part of the point. But the long-term impacts on kind of policy itself were kind of happy accent is wrong, but that was less foreseen and less discussed. They judged themselves and were largely judged about, how many acres of FSC certified wood, how many, all this, how many fisheries have MSC certification, what's the annual percentage of the fish catch that's MSC certified. For sure, direct impacts are first and foremost. It's just that when they scale out to be part of normal policy or part of normal regulation, all of a sudden you have this massive, from a sustainability perspective, you have this massive change in impact. So
that I think that clarifies things a lot. Changing tack a little bit. So I know some of your work has addressed the role of kind of scientific expertise in the policy process. I kind of alluded to that earlier. So I wanted to ask, seeing with the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen a lot of discussion around the role of kind of expertise and kind of the integrity of experts, and a lot of discussion about misinformation, etc. So looking at that and looking back on relating that to your previous work on the role of science and scientific advisory committees, etc., has what you've seen over the course of this pandemic, does it meet expectations? Have you been surprised?
I think it means it's amazing it's managed to meet both my highest expectations and my worst fears simultaneously.
Right.
Partially because, COVID is horrible, but there is no other case that any of us can think of where we have a literal perfect global comparison. So the other thing that you see wild differentials in what's happening in different places, which is fascinating, if not sometimes disturbing, depending on your perspective. But we also see a lot of things that we kind of would expect to see, right? So we see in some places, we see science advisors and committees taking on or being pushed into more explicitly political roles. And we see the damage that often causes. We see in other places much more success in protecting the importance of expertise, but over time it's getting harder, right? So that's the other thing, right? Is that one of the big issues with science advice is always how you deal with uncertainty and dealing with being wrong and how you communicate that to the public, but also to your decision maker. And of course, over time with COVID, we just, we keep getting surprised in ways that are almost entirely predictable, but still surprising. And so I think that a lot of what we understood about the challenge between values and science and how science answers questions and the kinds of values decisions politicians have to make have just been writ large with this. So I think one thing that I've long said is one of the big challenges, because I hang out a lot with scientists and engineers in my life, and I often hear this like, well, if the information is just better, like if people really understood what the science says, right, then they'd be able to make better decisions. And the problem, and I've seen this before, is that science can often be ambiguous, right? If we need to decide to lock down, like what is an acceptable, what will we accept for number of cases? What will we accept for numbers of deaths, right? Science may tell us approximately what we can predict. The experts may be able to tell us what we can predict. Whether that outcome is socially acceptable in any given context is not a scientific decision. And so this wrestle we're seeing at the interface, who interprets the science, who decides what's socially beneficial or socially acceptable, how do we deal with the trade-offs, is relatively as I would expect to see it. I mean, it's very interesting to watch it, and very interesting to watch different people come to different conclusions about it. It's interesting to see different structures of science advice be more or less successful. But we've also found, I've been involved with some international comparative projects. It's not so easy to say, oh, look, they're doing it really well over here, we should do it that way, because it might not work. Like what works in the South Korean context would probably not work in the American context. And so that's also a bit of a challenge. What's also interesting is who doesn't have really robust systems of science advice in this whole thing too. So we're seeing that as well. So places that have more formal structures or particularly legitimate actors who've been able to take up the role versus places that don't. So there's a lot of very interesting dynamics. But this values question, right? How do we interpret and how do we make that decision about socially what we're willing to do, given the science? I think that's where it's really hard.
So I think in the literature, there's this idea, I remember studying at least, the idea of maybe the appropriate or ideal role of a scientist is to be like an honest broker. Do you think that's still the role that they should play in terms of navigating this values versus science?
So I have the honest broker, I laugh because my international project is Roger Pielke's, the honest broker. So I've actually been looking at this through the honest broker lens. Two challenges with the honest broker. To be honest, one, and this is where we see it breaking down. We see people being what we call the issue advocate, which is that they think there should be a certain, like, we should lock down or we should do this or we should do that. And people, even if they're not, being perceived as being particular issue advocates. So that's one challenge, and that's much as we see from the literature. The problem with the honest broker, and I've had conversations with him about this, and he doesn't disagree, is that it kind of sees science advisors as like the single solitary big guy or girl, woman or man. Like it's a very kind of, the science advisor is acting on their own, not in a committee, not in a group, right? And has the capacity to understand the whole space. But we know that that's not true, both from like no person is that omnipotent, but also because they're often working in groups and they often have big blind spots because of whose expertise is or not out, right? So when the public health epidemiologists and doctors are doing it, where are the economists and the psychologists and the social scientists, right? And so one of the problems with the honest broker is that it breaks down because it's very almost impossible to be an honest broker because of your own biases. But yes, the less you seem to be kind of tainted by politics, the better it goes. But once again, it assumes in the honest broker that the scientist is the person who's calling the shots about how political they are being perceived. And I would argue what you see in at least some cases is that scientists who are acting in kind of quite good faith and in that model of not being an issue advocate still get blowback or get portrayed as being more political than they are.
Right.
You also see politicians ducking behind their science advisors for political decisions, even if the science advisors weren't the one making political decisions. And then what was the third thing I was going to say about this and the honest broker? Oh, like we saw in Hong Kong, we saw kind of other models essentially coming up, like using scientists as what we call trial balloons. So the science advisors would be like, oh, we think maybe we need to start thinking about whether we should have this kind of quarantine. And then sometimes that's what happens. And sometimes there's a big outcry and that's not what happens. And it's like sending them out there to suggest perhaps something may be warranted to kind of gauge what's going to happen. Because if the politician said it, it would be a big mess. But if the scientist says it and they don't really have decision-making power, so they're just saying it to see what people say, you know. So I think then that complicates, like we're seeing some complications on that model over time. This is much more of a repeated game too, right?
Yeah, which breaks the concept a little bit.
It starts to break. Oh, there was the last point was that sometimes science is what the decision makers actually don't want an honest broker. They don't want a long list of options. They want to know what to do.
Mm.
So there's some amount of demand for issue advocates internally. That's the other thing we've seen.
So I noticed that we're running a bit over an hour, so we'll start to close down. I just wonder, is there anything you'd like to talk about or mention when it comes to innovation systems for sustainability or any of the other issues that we've talked about that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
I think the one thing we kind of haven't had a chance to talk about that I think is really interesting is just the question about who gets involved in these. And I think one other really important aspect, it's not that other innovation systems don't have transnational, maybe not global, but transnational aspects. We certainly see technologies that move back and forth between countries. I mean, we can talk about the long history of developing and middle income countries, doing tech transfer from richer, more developed places, but that the need for transnational collaboration and coordination in the sustainability space, I think, is larger. Once again, because you're dealing with these kind of often transboundary problems, cross-generational problems. And that is not just about unidirectional from Europe or the US to the rest of the world, or China to the rest of the world, but back the other way and in between. And thinking about who are the actors who have the potential to keep that, to develop and have that kind of system, not even if you don't even just formalized, but like, how do we do a better job of learning from each other in smaller places, poorer places, right? Not just emulating, like you can't emulate China if you have a population of 10 million. It's just not going to happen, right? So how do we get more cross learning, and who's involved with that, right? What international organizations, what NGOs, foundations, how are universities involved? So I think one of the things we really have to think about are collaborative approaches, and truly collaborative approaches, not tech transfer or exploitative approaches. So I think that's just one thing I want to say. And I think that's one difference with innovation for sustainable development is we have a much stronger need to think a bit more about how we involve a broader set of actors in those conversations, how we recognize a broader set of solutions that may be there on the ground and not getting picked up that could be useful somewhere else. So I think that's just, and I think that came up when I gave my last talk, when I was talking about kind of the honeybee network in India, for example, as something that could be widely copied in other places and could have a huge amount of value, because a lot of what's out there we don't even capture well. Someone has a good idea and it's just kind of there and it does something, but what if some of those could scale or move? And so we're not even capturing what we already do well as we could. And I think that matters in sustainability perhaps more than other spaces, perhaps. So that's kind of my last thing we didn't get to. There's so much. I mean, I could go for hours and hours more. But.
Sure. Yeah. I want to ask follow-up questions, but so let me just leave you with one final question. So for people who are interested in learning more about innovation for sustainable development or any of the other things you've talked about, what sort of resources, people, organizations would you point them to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and I think a lot of it tends to be in particular, technology spaces, right? There's a ton out there on energy systems. I mean, places like the OECD and the various UN organizations obviously have huge amounts of data out there. For science advice, there's a group called INGSA, which is an international group of science advisors that do a lot of work on collaborating, writing reports, promoting best practice. They do this for science advice. There's also a bit in there actually on some of these other topics, sustainability, innovation as well, that they're interested in. There's a lot of work. I think the EU is doing a lot of work kind of through its mission-driven innovation push. And there's a lot of academics in Europe actually who are probably extremely well placed. Manchester, UCL, the Netherlands, across universities. So there's a lot out there. I don't think it's a great central repository as of yet, but WHO is really good if you're into the public health side of things still. Gates Foundation, some of the big players. But I think that part of it is just, I mean, the C40 for cities. Like, I just think there's a lot of people playing in this space, and there's a lot of places you can kind of dig up information and learn more, even just, without getting academic journals and such. There's a lot of really good reports out there that are starting to look at this.
Great. So it sounds like there's plenty to look at. Probably
there's
more.
Plenty to look at. Yeah. You can stay very busy. But you might have to look in sectors, right? You might have to pick particular areas or sectors. Like it's not going to be labeled under innovation for sustainable development per se, but green energy, water, agriculture, social innovation, right? Those are all big areas of discussion, I'd say.
Great. So with that, yeah, I'd like to thank you again for sharing your time and knowledge with us. I think you've given us a lot of really interesting cases and things to think about in general.
Well, thank you. This has been really enjoyable conversation, and I've greatly enjoyed it. So I hope
Great.
it's useful to at least a few people out there.
Yeah, I hope so as well. So thank you very much, those of you who are viewing, for your time today. We look forward to seeing you at our next productivity talk. And to get updated, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I hope you all stay safe, happy, and productive. Thank you.